recording. And we are now recording. So, without any further ado, I shall hand over to Helen and Mark from Thrive. And let's find out what's going to happen in 2025, or your thoughts around 2025. Please do keep the chat going. Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Mark, over to you.
I think it's already been introduced very well. So hopefully, thank you for joining us. Really lovely to have you with us. Hopefully this is going to be a session where we're going to be doing a bit of thinking big picture, trying to maybe make some of the stuff that's currently a little bit hard to understand where things are going, maybe give some tangible examples of what we're expecting to see over the next 12 months or so. But also we want there to be a bit of encouragement within this as well, and some actionable tips and things that you can take away and start thinking about straight away. So just to do some quick introductions, Helen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. And thanks everyone for joining this session today. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you, but also to hearing your perspectives and your views and hearing the answers to the questions that we ask you as well. I'm Helen Marshall. I'm Chief Learning Officer at Thrive. I've been with Thrive for 3.5 years now. I host the Diary of a CLO podcast, and I'm the founder of the Women in community as well. And I have primarily been involved in communicating what we do in Thrive out into the wider communities, and then relaying what's going on in the community back into the business. But primarily now my role is focused on internal talent development, which is very exciting. And I'll pass over to Mark.
Yeah, and I'm Mark Ward. I'm one of the founders at Thrive, and I'm generally a bit of a geek when it comes to learning technologies within organizations. And I'm very positive in terms of the impact that I think that we can see, and particularly at the moment with some of the new technologies that are available to us. I'm really excited about where things are going. So actually this presentation is like totally up my street. So we wanted to start, we're missing a slide. Want to start by just kind of asking you a question about your experiences in the L&D space. And in particular, our feeling is that there's quite a lot of sentiment around L&D teams kind of being told maybe that they're not doing enough, or that you're not focusing on the right things. And it might be internal stakeholders, but there's a sense that that's kind of in the atmosphere generally within our community, that we're not doing enough, and there's some kind of negative sentiment around that. We really want to start with flipping that around and saying, actually, there's a load of stuff that we're going to talk about here that is rooted in the tangible examples that are being seen today in organizations across the world. And from our own experience, we have been working with a number of teams and customers who are doing really innovative things. And I'm talking about the kinds of conversations where I, as someone who's been deeply rooted in this company and our products for a long time, I sometimes sit down and get asked a question of, so, how could we do this? And I think, I've never thought about that. So those are the really exciting conversations, the ones that drive us forward and go, actually, we can achieve something different. We can look at it in a different way. There's a kind of a few kind of really big stories for us through the year, but lots of examples of customers kind of helping to improve learner experience, saving time, and just generally being able to kind of demonstrate the impact that they're having within their organizations. And again, some of those themes are going to come up with some of the stuff that we're looking at more deeply today. So we kind of want to start with, I suppose, a question, and definitely opportunity to kind of like share your thoughts on this question in the chat. But this is a question that we've kind of asked our network, and particularly the women in group, I think Helen as well. But the kind of, what are the main things that we feel positive about that we did in 2024 that we want to build on and continue on in 2025? And the themes that kind of emerge from this are really interesting. And I won't read every single one of them out, but the kind of, for me, the picture that emerges is one of teams kind of managing to do stuff that is quite strategic. And strategic is generally the big stuff that gets talked about and shouted about, and that's the stuff that kind of we all want to be doing. However, we're always distracted, or like we're always being pulled into the tactical. And again, you can kind of see examples of this here. So continuous development as part of a business strategy is a very strategic thing, whereas maybe pushing back on training requests or that kind of thing might be a little bit more tactical. So some examples there and some things to kind of get us thinking as we move forward.
Yeah,
Um,
I also think, Mark, sorry to interrupt, but I think that kind of balance between what people are doing that they kind of need to get done right now in order to kind of almost build a relationship and build that trust with someone and show that they're delivering something versus actually their longer term strategy is that tension point and balance that most L&D teams are facing at the moment, and that kind of inability to focus on longer term strategic stuff versus actually just delivering things is often the thing that L&D teams are told they're not doing enough of that kind of bigger picture thinking, and actually they should be doing more of it. But actually, you really need to strike that balance between actually I need to deliver this now and build those relationships in order to do that bigger thing. And so I think that that's a really interesting tension that exists at the moment.
yeah, definitely. And well, I suppose that kind of moves us on quite nicely to a question that we want to ask you and get your thoughts on. We're going to kind of explore this in a couple of slides' time. But yeah, if you could have a little bit of think about what are your biggest organizational challenges at the moment. And we're really keen to see what themes come out of your answers on that. Um, and
I've opened up the large chat box
yes,
in underneath the slide. So if you can please put that in there. My apologies also to Mark and Helen. There was a question slide which you should have been asked an earlier question to think of. And as I was editing the slides earlier, literally the 2 minutes before we started, I managed to delete the slide from the deck. So my sincerest
no,
apologies
not necessary at all. You're fine.
to you both. Um,
That's all good.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, interesting. So, what are your organisational challenges? And we can see we've got. I can see there's loads of people already putting stuff in there. Let's have a look and seeing what people are thinking about there. I see Stella in the other box has put reduction in funding and changes to the commissioning of services. I think funding is going to be a challenge. What are your thoughts around this, Helen and Mark?
Yeah, well, whilst people add their thoughts into the box, I'll do a little bit of an overview of where we think the industry's at the moment. So please keep populating your answers in that box, and I'll come back to it in just a moment to take a look at everything that's gone on, and hopefully, Andrew, you can keep an eye on what's being said there if there are a whole range of responses, and maybe do a little bit of a summary when we come back to that
Yep, will
question.
do.
Thank you. Um, so I think it's really important to take stock of what's being said across the industry at the moment, and we all know how many industry reports are released on a yearly basis, and it can be quite tricky to keep on top of everything that is going on, everything that's being said. And one of the most brilliant resources I see out there that does a great job of summarizing all of those industry reports is Offbeat's L&D Trends Map. So I know Andrew's going to pop that link in the chat if he hasn't already. So do have a look at it if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. But ultimately, Offbeat do a great job of pulling together about 30 different industry reports to summarize what those key themes are and what the trends are within those reports. And it's probably of no surprise that the things that are being pulled out from last year in 2024 are all around human AI synergy, around the human technology kind of tension, around skills, around learning at an organizational level as well as an individual level. So probably good and positive to reinforce the sentiment that we're probably all feeling in terms of how we're delivering and what we need to deliver against. And the diagram that they pull together, you can see there's a circle on the right hand side. What they actually do is pull together how people are approaching solving problems right now, what solutions do they have available to them right now. And as the rings on the circle get closer towards the edge, the time scale increases. So you're starting off with a now in the middle, and you're then starting to go kind of 2, 5, 10, until you get to 20 years out on the edge of the circle. Now, what's worth calling out here is that, yes, whilst that's really important to think about, well, these are the trends, I know this is what's being spoken about. Actually, a lot of the things that appear on this circle are actually solutions to problems. And now, what might be more useful to think about, and this is probably a criticism of the industry reports more than it is the Offbeat L&D trends map, is that actually we don't know what problems are existing that people are trying to solve for. So as you start to think about those trends that are on the left hand side, if you start to then bring problems into the equation and start to kind of reframe what's going on via problem statements. So, is high turnover a problem? Do you have an unclear picture of what's going on in your workforce in terms of skills? Is your competitive advantage diminishing as a result of those things? You start to gain an understanding of the problems that are being faced right now, the problems that are being faced that might be faced in a few years' time, and ultimately thinking further out, actually what's going to happen in 20 years' time. Are we still going to have to be solving for the same type of problems that are existing now? So it's worth having a look at this trends map, have a look on there, see if it resonates with where you're at, where your organization's at, but also start to think about what those commonalities are in the problems and challenges that are being faced. And now is a great time to come back to what is being said in the chat in terms of what are your biggest organizational challenges at the moment, because we had a few comments around this in terms of some patterns that we're seeing in terms of budget and resource, obviously in terms of geopolitical landscapes, how you leverage technology and how you secure buy-in for things. But it'll be interesting to see if all of that is resonating with what you're experiencing within your own organizations. And Mark, I presume you've been keeping an eye on that chat and might have some comments on that.
Yeah, very good alignment. So lots of kind of concern around budgets, budget cuts, and also kind of just availability of people to have time to learn, which is kind of another form of resource. There's also plenty of comments around kind of buy-in and like people having a strong enough desire to learn and to engage with what's being made available. Um, just kind of reading a comment here from Kevin May. So my organizational challenge is how slow the organization moves, but the organization answer would be doing more with less, entering new markets, making money from. So again, kind of you've got a difficult landscape of wanting to achieve more with less, and also needing to kind of work against the maybe some of the decision making and all that kind of stuff within an organization. But I
Mm.
think there's really good alignment amongst these, to be honest. There's also one comment here about Karen Deneen evaluation, which is interesting because that's something that I think we're going to come back to a little bit later.
If you're
Definitely.
happy, I can show you something. So while everybody was working on this, I was working on taking all of this and building a word cloud. And
Brilliant.
that's what the word cloud of all your answers looks like.
It's interesting that the biggest organizational challenge that's coming out there is learning in general. I wonder if everyone just used that in their sentences that they were writing. Um,
It's really interesting. But people, culture, organization, thinking, effective, reactive capacity. It's
uh,
interesting to see what the results look like. I'll happily share this with people if you're interested. I've got the responses and I've anonymized them. So if you would like to see this afterwards, just get in touch with me through LinkedIn.
That's
yeah,
great.
brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. So it's interesting to see, I think, a lot of commonalities coming out in the challenges that you're facing there, but also probably unsurprisingly, things like capacity, resourcing, and what we spoke about right at the beginning in terms of that short term versus longer term thinking as well. So to put into context everything else that we're going to be covering today, again, thinking about what was going on in the industry last year, we're thinking about the Global Sentiment Survey, Don Taylor's Global Sentiment Survey. That the new updated version of that is going to be released. He normally releases it around February time. I think submissions and answers are still being accepted now. So if you've not done that, obviously now is a good chance to go away and do that. Um, the Global Sentiment Survey asks you in L&D what is important to you in the coming year. So last year, the Global Sentiment Survey contained a list of various things. And most interestingly, the stuff that we're going to be speaking about today in terms of skills, personalisation, automation, and how you then leverage AI for those things appeared really close to the top of that list. So what that tells me is that actually whilst we think that those things are going to be really important for the year ahead, are we really going to be able to action and implement anything around them in those 12 months? So 12, 18, 24 months down the line, where are we at in terms of actually actioning any of these things? But what I would also say is that the items that are called out on the sentiment survey are a mixture of problems and solutions. So things like delivering value or driving or showcasing value, I think is one of them, showing value, versus micro-learning. So micro-learning, a solution to something, showing value, a problem that L&D need to overcome. So again, just taking that with a pinch of salt in terms of it's not as black and white. But really interesting to know that those things that we're focused on right now are top of this list and important, and it'll be interesting to see how they pan out when the results are released for this year. Lastly, just to sum up, one of the reports that I think is worth highlighting is one of Don Taylor's reports again, but Egler, Vinashkarte, and Don Taylor created. They've created a series of reports around AI and L&D and how the two are hand in hand at the moment. And in a webinar where they were releasing the results of some of that research, they released this AI and L&D complexity scale, so showing this kind of cliff edge drop after things like administrative tasks and learning and content design before getting into the more sophisticated uses of AI around personalisation skills and performance support, for example. So I think it's going to be this year, we're actually going to see the trend of this curve actually going up in the other direction. We are already seeing that and hearing examples of how L&D are starting to showcase impact that is outside of efficiency uses of AI within their own teams. So that's a real positive in our perspective. And in our experience. So we'll wait and see what else happens there. But I think it's also worth calling out that when we're talking about that tactical versus strategic thinking, this focus on content on the left-hand side to business performance on the right is actually something that is a broader challenge for L&D in general. And I'll come back to talk about that at the end. So really interesting to see the correlation of how we're utilizing AI and how we're approaching impact in general as we move through into the year as well. And Mark, I'll then pass over to you to dig into some of those trends that we're seeing.
And look at some of the key trends and challenges that maybe sum things up. And allow us to kind of just focus and think about some examples. Again, I would encourage you, please do ask questions as you go. We are going to have time for questions at the end, but if there's questions that pop up that we kind of want to address during the presentation, we'll absolutely do that. So yes, we're going to look at these kind of categories and have a little bit of a think about also, how does AI support in these areas? AI is not the most important thing in this equation at all, but it is an incredible tool and it's a transformative tool. So this is really where we kind of start to look at the radar that Helen was looking at earlier on even, and saying, the items that are 2 years out or 5 years out, they become less well defined. And that's really because we don't know what the impact of some of these new capabilities are going to be, and we don't know how tools are going to shift. And that's some of kind of what we're going to give some conjecture on today. So, one second. I'm going to go back just for 1 second and highlight on this slide the look at this L&D complexity scale. Really, what we're going to be talking about here is, in effect, how will we see these different areas lift up on this chart? What do we expect to see in these areas? So just thinking about like personalization, skills practice, data analysis, performance support, skills management, these are all more and more advanced. Hopefully we're going to kind of give some tangible examples of how we might see things shift that might mean that line changes. So starting with just some thoughts really, and learning systems remaining essential to delivering personalized learning in 2025. It'd be really interesting to see your thoughts in the chat in terms of how well you agree with that and how well aligned you are with that statement. It's certainly something that's received a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks, and certainly learning management system being dead is something that we've heard for a very long time as a possibility. I think that there are some interesting angles to the current debate. On the one side, I think there are those who are thinking that perhaps the platform and the tooling just won't be necessary at all in the future. However, I think that for many people, if we look at what a learning system is there to achieve, again, it's a personalized question because, of course, what you need from your learning management system will be different. But if we're looking at what they're there to achieve, then we can kind of see that there are some kind of core principles, and we can ask ourselves whether those are going to continue to be relevant. So things like maybe like storing information and knowledge and categorizing it, making it accessible to people. That is one function of a learning management system for some organizations. Informing people and pushing learning when it's important for people to have that knowledge, or to have a competency, mandatory learning, that kind of stuff. That's another function that's very commonly part of what a learning management system does. And then finally, many systems also offer an angle of enabling professional development. It might be through manager interaction and creating goals. It might be through just kind of providing recommendations and encouraging talent mobility. But again, this is the kind of function of a learning system. And so to kind of consider, do we think that those things are going to disappear as needs within an organization? My personal answer to that would probably be that it's not going to go away as a need. But what I think many people are reflecting on is that we can kind of imagine that these systems and these things are going to be approached in very different ways. Helen, I'll pause there. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest shift we're going to see is in the interface that people interact with these systems through. So whilst the experience that people have of what is a technically a learning system may will definitely change, the back end of what's going on, yes, it will be enhanced by a new technology, but ultimately it's still going to exist in fundamentally the same way. Our user experience is going to shift and change. Things will be more personalized as a result of that interaction because it's understanding. It's kind of, for me, the way I think about it is at the moment we're spending a long time prompting AI to do things, but actually it might be that the AI starts to prompt us in order to do things. So there's going to be a shift in user experience there that ultimately will, for me, will be much more positive. So I think the rhetoric that's going on at the moment around LMS is dead. No one needs an LMS. Is actually how are people going to experience the LMS and how are they going to interact with it? And as that interaction changes and experiences do become more personalized to you as an individual, it then becomes a much different picture in terms of the impact you could be having on a broader cultural perspective and things like talent retention and your attrition rate, for example. So I think it starts to become a much more holistic experience at that point.
Yeah, I agree. So a useful kind of example that I've been using, and I've found works on a number of different slides, so I'm going to stick with it. But an example would be something like manager training, and it might be that we actually talked. There were some comments earlier on in the chat around skills and kind of reluctance to pin too directly to a particular kind of ontology or a particular word even. And actually, manager is a good example. Like management, you could consider to be a high level skill, or you may have a particular focus on maybe one-to-ones and how one-to-ones are delivered within an organization, and that becomes a high level skill, a high level objective. But ultimately within organizations, it is true to say that there are themes and things that we want people to be better at. And at the moment in the kind of current world, we generally focus on creating a resource pack, let's say, or a curriculum, maybe a pathway or a program. All of these different words are used, but ultimately we're going to create a set of resources and we're going to guide people to complete those resources. There may be some assessment at the end, but basically it's going to be a singular experience. And this does involve people then being kind of taken to the box, asked to open the box, do all of the things, and then move on with their day. And I think that this is an example where we can see that actually we're receiving a lot of questions and there is a lot of interest from L&D teams around how will that experience change and how will it be made more dynamic. So in particular, looking at how can we maybe enable that to be something that works in a way that recognizes the particular needs based upon someone's role, or perhaps skills passports was one of the items on the radar. But perhaps it would be great if we could actually just understand whether or not someone has the skills that they need. Perhaps they're really excited about and they're really into delivering one-to-ones, and they're a real geek about all of that kind of stuff, in which case they're probably going to be pretty good at it already. So again, being able to adapt that experience based upon the kind of position that someone's in already. And this takes us into kind of an interesting topic then of like, how would we then need to shift the experience from an administrative point of view and from a learner point of view? From an administrative point of view, we would probably become more focused on the outcome, the learning outcome that we're trying to get to. And from a learning point of view, we would probably expect to see more going on in terms of assessment. And that kind of takes us to this piece on what forms of assessment do we have, and how do we kind of anticipate that changing? For me, I'm just going to actually skip forward and see. Right, okay. For me, this is actually these three boxes represent things that you can put under that sliding scale, that line that we saw earlier on with the cliff edge, because knowledge recall is something that we already test, and we already encourage people to build knowledge through e-learning, very traditional e-learning techniques. And applying AI to that is a pretty quick win, and it's something that we've many of us will have dabbled with in terms of generating assessments and automatically administering those assessments as well. Where we get to maybe the application of skills and the experience that people have got, the experiential learning, it's more difficult to assess. And application of behaviors, again, more difficult to assess again. And in these areas, we are actually seeing that there are forms of assessment that can be more valuable. They go beyond the knowledge, which actually everyone can kind of go on ChatGPT and get it to pump out some text and kind of demonstrate an understanding. So increasingly, we're going to need to look at experience and behaviors in order to understand where people are at and maybe what level of support they need in order to reach a particular learning outcome, whether that's mandatory learning or just something that's special to their role, or something that they're trying to do professional development on. And so, yeah, again, if we think about that line, I can kind of see that today there's a lot of capability around knowledge recall and assessing that. But what I would expect to see over the course of the next year is innovations where it comes to how we actually assess the experience within skills and the application of behaviors and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I see this as a real opportunity for AI, really. And it's always been something that people have struggled with. Is it's easy to do the knowledge recall stuff. It's much harder to showcase the application of skills or behaviors. So how can we leverage that technology in order to make that easier for us to do? And I know that will build nicely into your next few points, Mark, but I think it's a really exciting time to think about the opportunities that this affords us, particularly from that kind of application of skills and therefore behaviors perspective.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I was just looking at my notes. I did that very smoothly, didn't I? No one noticed. Uh, so, as we kind of look at that as an example of a paradigm that's going to need to shift over the course of the next year or so, it may, we're making predictions about how we think that's going to move forward. That's something that we're discussing a lot, and it's an example of the thing that we're kind of doing research around and exploring. But it may not be that that we're in the realms of the unknown unknowns. But certainly, when we look at anything that's more personalised, we get into a territory of saying some of the analysis that we do today is actually not going to work very effectively. So if I want to know whether or not people are doing their mandatory learning, have they done their manager training or their one-to-one training? Currently, we focus very much on completions and dates of completion and whether or not they need to do it again soon and that kind of stuff. And so those reports are often very much like, yes, they did it on this date, very log focused. That doesn't work so well when you're in a place where potentially someone is being asked questions on these topics more continually, and similarly, being pushed to or nudged to complete learning in the areas where they need it on a more continual basis as well. A date becomes less relevant. And so you can imagine perhaps, analysis might move down the road of heat maps. We might end up seeing, columns for the different learning outcomes. And then, row by row, we've got different departments or teams. And then we can see a heat map of how strong the knowledge is in each of those areas for each of those teams. And that's kind of an interesting thought about how we might see some of the basics, the stuff that we do every day, changing quite significantly. Another example that comes out of that, though, is if you can take a particular skill and skill area. Again, we talked about one-to-ones earlier on, and it might be that in the example that I was giving, the business was really interested in improving one-to-ones because there was a sentiment within the staff survey that line management and one-to-ones weren't good enough, or that people didn't feel supported. That's the kind of thing that we can look at, and we do look at today as a measurable KPI, a measurable way of understanding where we're at. But if we're in a world where instead of creating pathways and syllabuses and that kind of stuff, instead of doing that, we're focused on the outcome, we're focused on the learning outcomes, then that makes it much easier for us to join that data into the picture of whether or not our learning resources, whether or not the learning is having a tangible impact on the thing that we're trying to change. And again, talking about how we can envisage our analysis, maybe being able to combine the heat map of, yes, we think that people understand this here, alongside the, actually, we're not seeing the results that we expected, even though we think that people understand it. That's the kind of analysis that really, it's very, very difficult to do that today, but it's going to become increasingly easier for that to happen in the future, I think.
It also extends beyond recognizing individual skills or lack of, and actually it helps organizations to understand where in their business these skills exist and how they can move them into different areas as well. So certain areas of a business might have a high proportion of people who are skilled at one-to-ones, for example, and how can you utilize that knowledge in other areas. So I think it becomes more about that, potentially into that, is extending into that talent mobility piece as well.
Yeah, and that, I totally agree. And that leads us on to automation, which was kind of the third kind of theme area that we picked out from the trends and the analysis. And really, again, as a kind of a thought experiment here, we can evaluate this sentence. So we need to revolutionize the way we deliver learning more than the way that we administer it. There's a lot of focus on the left-hand side of the AI maturity scale, a lot of focus on how do we make administrative tasks take less time. Things that we're doing today that currently are laborious, let's use AI to help solve those. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing, and it's the obvious starting point. But I think when we start to see these paradigms shift, as they will need to, we're going to start to see that there's actually new tasks that emerge and new opportunities for things to be done in an automated fashion. So to give an example of this, again, I'm going to take you back to that heat map. You might be imagining that there's a picture of whether or not people are compliant, whether or not people have got a strong understanding of a topic. Maybe it's one-to-ones again. And we find that we're sat down with our leadership team and we're showing them these results, and they can see an area of red, like that's not looking good. People don't understand these aspects. What have you done about that would be the next question. And actually, it would be excellent to be in a place where the system can actually just answer that for you and say, because we noticed that there is this area, maybe these particular aspects of the learning are not strongly understood within these teams, I actually started rolling out more training, more resources on this to these individuals on this date, and these are the number of people that have accessed it, and this is the impact that it's had on our KPIs. If you could get there, that's really probably further away than a year, but it's the direction of travel, I believe, in terms of how we're going to see systems begin to ease things off and reduce the workload in terms of automation. That for me is where it gets really exciting.
Side is automated, we don't necessarily need to think too long and hard about that. But actually, the whole experience from end to end is much more focused on who the person is, what they need to do, what the organisation needs to do, and how they're going to deliver those outcomes that are needed. And I think Kat Gray earlier on in the chat said something around it's important to keep the learning experience top of mind and to design learning solutions and systems that work well together to keep learners engaged, which I completely agree with. I think it's the whole learning experience that is more important than the administration of it. And obviously that was summed up in what Mark just said.
Yeah. David Parker's asked a question: what examples of automation have you seen used for suggested learning for individual learners? Which is a great question. I think for me, there are some capabilities that we've got within our own platform that allow us to hide certain resources or basically make them so that they don't need to be completed as someone's completing pathway, and that can be done based upon their role. So that kind of training needs. But where it comes to actually assessing and saying, is someone already strong in this? In which case, let's kind of skip that. It's something that we are very much looking at. We're adding capability around that at the moment, and we're figuring out the best way to bring that in, because actually we're keen to make sure that that's something that can be used flexibly across a range of different needs. For example, if we over focus on mandatory learning, then we're not going to get the benefit when it comes to comms or just like pushing out a new policy update or something along those lines. There are some tools out there that I'm kind of thinking more on the content side, where perhaps someone's starting a piece of content and has an assessment up front in order to kind of pre-diagnose what they need to focus on. Helen, are any things you'd call out?
I'm just thinking about kind of things that we're using in our own daily lives to access information and learning. So things like Spotify and I'm gonna use the word Netflix. I know that word either be
Common
love
stuff.
or hate in a learning context, but things like that source that bring things to your attention after you've listened to or interacted with different things. So I think that's an interesting angle to view that question through as well.
Excellent. Right. Well, we will carry on. And again, I'm pretty confident there'll be good time for questions at the end. So I'm going to hand over to you for these slides, Helen.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think, yeah, if anyone has any questions, I know there's been a lot of chat going on, but if anyone has any specific questions that they want to ask based on what we've said so far, then obviously feel free to pop them in the questions for the presenter chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. And I suppose just to sum up everything that we've really focused on there, what ultimately what we're focused on is driving the business outcomes that you're looking for. So I mentioned at the beginning around that cliff drop from administrative tasks towards more kind of sophisticated uses of AI. When we look at Laura Overton's L&D values spectrum, we see the same kind of pattern emerging, that actually in her research, what's being shown is that I think 80 to 90% of the L&D teams she was working with at the time were really focused on content outcomes. So the engagement metrics, the efficiency focus, the CSAT scores, NPS, all that kind of good stuff that's an initial indicator of engagement, but actually only 10% of teams were focused on value that was placed on business outcomes. So things like talent mobility, things like time to competency, the things that we really need to be starting to shift the needle on, weren't actually really being heralded as the focus of the L&D team. And so we've started to see definitely over the past 12 months that actually we're starting to see people doing that and starting to think in this direction in a much more open way, and communicating that out into the industry as well. So when we're thinking about that drop from AI being utilized for content efficiency and actually it being a pretty flat line in terms of business outcomes, actually what we're going to start to see are teams that are focused on sustaining and creating a certain type of culture that's over here on the right hand side of Laura's value map. And we're going to think about how AI can enable us and better enable us to do that. So I think a task that might be quite useful for you to think about right now is, how do you want to split your time? So or how are you currently splitting your time? How have you been splitting your time historically? Are you 70% focused on content outcomes, 20% on business outcomes, and 10% on cultural outcomes? Is that what you want to be doing? Actually, if you sat down and thought about it, I bet most of you would be saying, well, I want to be, I don't know, 40% business outcomes, 40% cultural outcomes, and only 20% content outcomes. So maybe just pop in the chat how you would split your time if you actually had to sit down and think about it right now. And actually, if you were going to start thinking about how you could do some of these things, there are some basic metrics that you can start to measure against in terms of these areas. So when we're thinking about content outcomes, I always say that they're a great place to start. That kind of those views, those completions, what your CSATs are saying. It's great to have that information, but how are you building on it and how are you extending that out to the business outcomes? So how are you impacting revenue? How are you reducing attrition? Are you increasing tenure through your programs? Do you have an increased rate of talent mobility? And then as you start to think about cultural outcomes, what's your engagement survey saying? What's verbatim feedback across the business? Are your line managers doing what they need to? Or are you starting to hear rumbles of things not working properly? That qualitative data is just as important as the increased sales metric that you might be able to track more easily. So how are you doing this across your business? What metrics could you be measuring? And how do you start to shift towards those broader business outcomes that we all know we want to be doing? And then ultimately, how do you leverage AI in order to help you do those things more effectively? So just to sum up before we head into our Q&A session, I think there's a quote on screen that we really like, and that is, the ability to learn faster than your competitors may be the only sustainable competitive advantage you have. So understanding how people learn, how you can do that better, and how you can enhance people's skills within your organization will set you apart from your competitors. And ultimately, that's what we all want to do for our businesses at the end of the day. So we'll leave it at that. Hopefully we've got some questions and answers. Hopefully we've got some questions coming through. We'll have the answers, hopefully, and we'll see what comes through on the chat. Yeah.
We have some questions, but the chat is just been awesome because it's like I love the fact you're here, Adam. Brilliant to see you, especially dialing in from the States as well. It's lovely to have you here. And yeah, brilliant conversation going on between you and Kevin, and yeah, I'm just sitting looking at this and going, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. So. Really good stuff in there. Something that Adam, you actually did pick up was something that I'd like Helen and Mark to look at. You said you've been working with clients on AI for personalisation, and their biggest struggle is defining what personal criteria should drive those experiences and what the results should be. I'm really interested in Helen and Mark. What are your thoughts around what Adam's asking there about that personalisation and AI?
Yeah, I called this out because I think it's a really interesting challenge that actually how do you know what data points to start from? I don't necessarily have an answer for this, by the way. I just thought it was a really interesting question to ask, and Mark probably got something lined up. But
You've lined me up. No,
well,
that's so. This actually links back to the Netflix thing, and I there's been some comments around Netflix having a really bad interface and give me a whole range of different things that I can look at about a person, activity, attributes, all of that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to basically make it really fuzzy and blurry. And I'm going to kind of just not worry too much about what the detail is in there. I'm just going to look at what does the shape of it look like. And then I'm going to look for other people that have got a similar shape. And then I'm going to say, actually, the next thing that they did was this. The next thing that they did was this. They really like this. And so that's a technology that does enable us to identify patterns in behavior, patterns in the learning that people are doing, and then recommend things based upon that without even really having to worry about it too much. And I think that this is really important as we move forward because we talked about the need for you know training needs analysis based upon role. What department are you working in? What kind of work are you doing? Those things are currently stuff that we have to set up very laborious interfaces for. We have to create a group. We have to assign a thing. We have to say these people needs to do this thing, and it's all manual. Whereas actually with technology like that, we are able to start understanding and saying, well, actually, this area is probably one that doesn't need to worry about this training. And it's going to be a case of exploring that tentatively, because of course the risk is if it's not been set out and structured manually, then we've not got that absolute guaranteed knowledge that yes, this is going to go to those people, and that's where the tension exists between what the technology can do today and what organisations are trying to get out of it. That's my very passionate answer about, and I've brought it back to Netflix as well.
Awesome. I agree with your comment there, Helen, as well, saying about you think user experience the user's experience of platforms is important to pay attention. And I agree with you, because if people are used to those channels, they will use those channels. I think this is an issue we've got in the AI space as well, because there's something I talk about: bring your own AI, and people are bringing their own AI to work right now, and that's a challenge because people are used to using it. You can suddenly can't go, oh, you can't use this anymore, and I think there's a real challenge there. There's a couple of questions I've seen. So from Khalid, how might a lot of this apply to employees who are operational, don't have access to this technology in the same way while they're doing the job? I'm really interested in your thoughts on this.
My personal perspective on this is that I think technology, in the moments where those more operational roles might be using it, will be potentially powered by AI in ways that aren't necessarily obvious. So it will just become part and parcel of the way that those individuals are going about their work and their lives. And so it's less of an important conversation because you don't necessarily know that you're interacting with it or that it's part of what you're doing unless it's explicitly called out. So I think it's a really interesting question to pose. And I suppose that the question around that is how are those roles interacting with technology at the moment, and how might certain elements of their roles be potentially automated in the future, and what does that free their time up to do? So yeah, I think it's certainly something interesting to think about.
Mm. Mark, any thoughts on that in particular?
Problem as well from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, again, it's the channels people are already using. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and they were talking about how WhatsApp is the way that everybody chats in the organisation. So, guess what? Do it through WhatsApp. It's
Yeah.
host the things on WhatsApp, put the stuff there, and allow that to be used in that way, and use the technology that people have got. Adam also asked asked about people using anonymizing technology to use personal data for personalization without risking privacy. Is there a way that we can use personal data without some of the privacy issues, perhaps? Has that come across as anything for you, Helen and Mark? Have you found anything around that? Is this anonymization and GDPR and data protection, is that going to be an issue in 2025?
I am
It is.
100% letting Mark answer that question.
It is certainly a consideration. There are many forms of machine learning and AI that don't require us to take personal information and then kind of bake them into a trained model. So there are other approaches that we can take. For example, I mentioned that kind of Netflix approach earlier on. You can generate a mathematical representation of a person. It's not backward. You can't reverse engineer that and say, oh, all of that came from this. But it does give you the shape, which is useful then for kind of recommendations and that kind of stuff. So that's a good example of a technology that we can use without having those kinds of concerns. On the other hand, large language models and that kind of stuff certainly are trained on resources that are owned by the organization. And there's a question around, how do you guarantee that, if you've got 10,000 resources within a system today, how do you guarantee that that doesn't include anyone's names? How do you guarantee that doesn't include photographs of people and all of that kind of stuff? So that challenge is something that has already been encountered, and is something that we're kind of having to identify ways to kind of like introduce protections. But ultimately, the best approach there is kind of do a little bit of half and half. Like have a large language model that has the core knowledge, and then as you're asking it a question, provide it with additional information in real time so that it can answer that stuff. That then puts you in a place where you can be compliant with GDPR, erase data when you need to, and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I hard agree. And Sarah has actually said there is potentially a profiling risk with that approach. So it's overcoming that with your data protection team. So really interesting. This balance and this, it's moving around this whole piece. um, Interestingly, we had same conversations in 2005 when we talked about bringing our mobile phones to work, and it was like well, can you have work conversations over the phone, and that kind of thing. And this is kind of bring your own device thing, I think, is really interesting. And it's the how people are using the tools and how the data they're actually willing to share. We will see some cases around it, I've got no doubt at all. Kristen has asked a great question. Do you have an example of how to use AI for assessing the application of skills or behavior?
There are some cool skill application across their organization to determine how often certain conversations are happening using a call tracking tool that identifies certain skills that they want their teams to be utilizing. And what's really interesting about that case study is that we can see real opportunities to apply that same method in Thrive because we use call tracking tools when we're communicating with our customers. So we can actually track certain topics and skills that are being utilized on those calls to make sure that people are following a certain process or they're coaching someone through a conversation in the right way. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting examples that are already starting to come through utilizing technology that's already available and probably already being utilized by a lot of businesses without them necessarily realizing as well.
Yeah, excellent. Uh, Another one that I've seen is actually asking some of these large language models for what would be an assessment rubric for the application of these skills and behaviours. So, what would good look like for somebody who studies this thing? What would good look like? What would great look like? What would brilliant look like? What would poor look like? And actually use that to find exemplars of it. And then it becomes a lot easier for the manager, Chrisin, to be able to do that kind of assessment to a map of what good should look like. So it can't do everything for you, but it can at least point in the right direction, which is something interesting to do.
Well, because actually at the moment we've got a problem of people wanting to assess at different levels in order to understand. And so, sorry, in order to understand level of competency. So it might be that we're just asking someone to describe something. It might be that actually what we need to see is a video demonstration of someone doing it successfully or whatever else it might be. And at the moment we create separate things like gateways for them to complete it. One is a this, one is a that, and then we kind of basically end up giving our team members a lot of additional. It might be our subject matter experts, it might be our managers, but they end up reviewing a lot of stuff that maybe they don't need to. And I think it is an exciting thought to think that the tooling might get better and probably really could get better at identifying when it needs support automatically. So actually just looking at something as a piece of evidence for a particular learning outcome and going, okay, well, that's just a description. So I know that you're there. You've got the ability to describe, but I'm not going to bring anyone in for this because you're only at level one. Whereas something more advanced, someone's uploaded a video. Actually, I'm going to wait for help and I'm going to ask someone to come in and review this for me. That level of automation would be super helpful within organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I'm going to wind us in. We're in our last 90 seconds now. So, massive thank you, Helen and Mark. You can see the on the left hand side, you've got a link to the Offbeat report. You've got Helen's and Mark's contact details through LinkedIn if you want to connect with them. If you want to connect with me, although I don't know why you would, but I'm on there as well. The future webinars and also the recordings and the links will be on there. And I've also put in the global sentiment survey by Donald H. Taylor and also the work that he did with Egler. Which is really interesting. So you've got a link to those reports as well. I strongly suggest to have a look back at the recording of this because there was some really good stuff in there. If you were interested in the some of the other things, so like for example the word cloud, Helen posted about this session earlier on LinkedIn today, and I replied to that and I've added the image to your LinkedIn, Helen. So you've actually got it on your LinkedIn with the word cloud stuff that people are talking about as well. So if you want it, it's all out there. It's all in the public. It's I'm not just sitting here doing nothing. I am trying to keep stuff going at the same time. So massive thank you, everybody. Delighted you're able to join us. Thank you, Adam, for joining us from the States, and doing it slightly later means we've got a much more international audience. So really appreciate everybody joining in. Thank you for the session today. We will be closing the room in a moment and putting you all back in the lobby, but rejoin us again in 2 weeks' time when, like I said, we've got 2 sessions. The first one definitely will be David James. We know David's going to be joining us, but if I don't see you before, I will see you then, hopefully. Take care, everybody.